we are blessed in many ways here on the Cape. If we look at the depth of our intellectual and our creative capital here, it is second to none. I always say when I make speeches in district that I'm blessed to represent the best state Senate district in the United States. I actually have made the mistake of saying that out of district a few times. It doesn't go over as well in district. Usually when I say I represent the best state Senate district in the United States, people actually clap. Just another lame effort to get the blood flowing. They've been eating cookies. Yeah, you get the sugar high. That happened at about 2 o'clock, and now it's a little after 3, and now you're getting the sugar low. I understand this has been a rabble-rousing day, and you've had a lot thrown at you and a lot of great presentations. And I know that Bob Cody, is Bob still here? Yes. Gave a great presentation about the college and STEM and some of the initiatives there. One of the reasons this is the best state Senate district, everybody thinks it's about the environment, but it really, is this thing happening on the stage, on the screens too? Well, no, it's not that it's distracting. I actually get motion sickness, and if I throw up in a couple minutes, it's because I'm getting the peripheral on the side and I'm getting the thing in front of me. I can close this, right? Okay, thank you. Oh, all right. Now you have no choice but to look at me. So again, it's the environment here, obviously, but if you look at the players here, from the community college to the tech school to the Economic Development Council, which I've sat on for 17 years and which gave some of the original seed money, as I'm sure you've heard, for the startup of our the other high-speed internet service that's going to be around the Cape, other than the competition to Comcast, to the Cape Cod Commission, which has really emerged over the past decade as real leaders in what the future of Cape Cod looks like, not only for environmental planning and land use planning, but also the economic planning, as demonstrated. And Leslie Richardson now is sitting here, has done a great job on that through the SEDS document to really define what our future can and should look like. So the topic I'm supposed to talk about is smarter leadership. And I guess from my perspective, that would be on the political end and trying to undo the fact that many people hear political leadership sort of as one of those oxymorons out there, and smarter political leadership especially. But I do want to talk about that a little bit because of how we define ourselves regionally and that intellectual and creative capital we have. I want everybody just to stop and think for a minute and imagine with me. Imagine a region, imagine a Cape Cod 20 years from now that has continued the trajectory of some of the things that we're talking about today. So imagine a Cape Cod that is a net producer of energy. Luke has been a tremendous leader in the private sector, and there's been some great leadership on the public sector. But imagine 20 years from now, our kids who are now 15 to 20 are in their 30s and 40. Imagine a Cape that is actually producing through renewable and sustainable energy and into a smart grid that has been rebuilt and actually exporting electricity and energy from our region into the grid. And ISO would be scratching their head saying, oh my God, what do we do? They've been taking and taking for generations, now they're giving back. But imagine that. Imagine that energy being fed into the grid and then being redistributed out in an infrastructure that has actually been rebuilt, most of which is underground. We had a storm back in February, and we're going to do more than imagine about it, but we had a storm back in February. We have about 160,000 electric customers on the Cape. 100,000 of those customers were out during and after the February blizzard. And for those of us who went to some of the shelters, either to talk to some of the folks or went to the shelters because we were those who were impacted, that can't be the Cape Cod of the future. I mean, I walked around the shelter, the DY shelter, and I was thinking, oh my God, is this a harbinger? Is this the future of Christmas, if you will? And it can't be. and it's in our control to prevent that from happening. But when you drive around the Cape and you see an aging infrastructure, electric infrastructure, in some cases poles that are 40, 50 years old, on a grid that is not ready to receive all the distributive, beautiful energy that Luke wants to put into it, and figure out how to do with it. Cape Air, for a while, the largest solar project on the Cape. Now we're not even close. But it took us months, literally months, to get the engineering plans back from NSTAR and to get the hookup done. One of the largest constituent issues we have in our office, in our state Senate office, is people who are having problems with our utility companies, either getting hookups, getting distributive energy, renewable energy plans done and hooked up there, but even just developments, building a building and saying, when can we have the hookups done? Dealing with a developer in Brewster now who's doing a development, wants to put all of the electricity to that development underground and cannot get an answer. When is the engineering going to get done, and when are we going to be able to get the hookups done? So we know that we have a ways to go, but again, if you imagine that we've seized this, if you imagine that we do all the projects that are on the books and those that aren't, if you imagine that we have the wherewithal to force or to lead in rebuilding our energy grid, that is something that's achievable. Imagine the wastewater project that I'm sure you talked about today. Thinking locally, we didn't talk about it? Well, we're about to talk about it. Because imagine that when we dig up the earth to actually do some of that infrastructure developing, we think, okay, now that we have dug up the earth, are there opportunities to put other things there, like some of the wires that we're talking about, like some of the water infrastructure, both drinking water and wastewater? And we should be thinking about that. We should be thinking about bundling our infrastructure as we go forward on the Cape. We should be requiring these things of those companies that we deregulated and turned into investor-owned utilities years ago. We should be saying, okay, if we did that, if we gave the investors the opportunity to make a return on these utilities, and if the CEOs are making literally millions and millions of dollars, what are we asking back as ratepayers and people who depend on those utilities? And we should be seeing that not only as an opportunity relative to the financial side of it, but we should be seeing it as an opportunity to define the future and to have a vision as we want it. So imagine, imagine, imagine. And I just think that it is ripe with opportunity. Now, how does that connect to the economy that we all have been here talking about today, building? Well, it completely connects because it creates jobs while we are spending that 20 years building it. And then once we've done building it, we've got an infrastructure that is going to define the economy going forward. And I know you guys have talked about that today. So I want to talk a little bit, too, about what we need to get it done on the government end. Because you heard Luke talk about the SRECs, some of the grants, some of the support that we get from the public sector for doing a lot of this good work. And here's my pitch today. My pitch today is I need your help, all of your help, because in spite of the fact that the Dow Jones Industrial Average is at the record high that it's been, and in spite of the fact that corporate profits are as high as they've ever been in this country, and not unrelated to what we talked about with NSTAR before, utilities are making good money, as are a lot of the rest of corporate America. The stock market has recovered. The recovery for the people at the top has been significant. And yet, when we go, and we're going to be doing our budget in the Senate in next week, actually, when we go to do our budget, we're going to find that we don't have money to invest in the future infrastructure, in the vision that we're talking about, in the imagine that we're imagining for what this place could look like, in everything from having solved the wastewater to having utilities that actually serve us instead of the other way around. And the issue comes down to revenue. And we don't have the revenue to fund all this in government right now, in spite of how the economy has recovered for a few and hasn't recovered for everybody else. So one of the things we're going to be talking about at the State House is, how do we fund all this stuff? Not only how do we fund a vision for the future, but how do we take care of those at the bottom who are least fortunate and not have everything be a Sophie's choice every time we sit down to look at our budget? We have the capacity now to be looking at an economy that is prosperous and can provide for everybody. And we need to do a better job of that. So part of the Imagine is, can we fund the ambitious projects that we have? Can we have the smart technology and smart infrastructure that we want? Can we be taking care of those in need, not closing Head Start centers like we're closing in Brewster, cutting education like we've seen over the last number of years? All of those things that we know we depend on for a forward-looking future. So I think I'd like to riff on some questions, if you all have some questions that you'd like to ask, and have a little bit of a dialogue in here because it is a smaller group. As Paul said, I'm totally committed, been very involved in a lot of these issues over the last 10 to 15, even 20 years. And I think there are opportunities to create private sector jobs that will strengthen the economy at livable wages, good, strong jobs, while coming together, having our public process define what we want these areas to look like, and engaging the private sector in creating jobs and building it. So shoot me some questions, if you will. Yes.
Please wait for the microphone so the 60,000 cable households that are seeing this and the tens of thousands that are watching on the internet can hear your question.
We are streaming live, Senator. We're streaming live as well. So, no, if you were in a power position globally, maybe just the country, I mean, what sources of revenue would you realistically think we should be looking at? I mean, we have pressing needs on Cape Cod. We need better transportation. We need to solve our wastewater problem, or why bother? You know, telecom is here. It's great, but it's up in the air. You know, so what kind of revenue streams, I'm sure that you've thought about, at least from the country standpoint, and maybe drill down to a state level?
Well, there's two issues. One is the source of revenue, and the other is how do we get back to a relatively healthy economy for everybody. So I'm going to broaden out and talk a couple of big picture issues here because I think they are related to getting some of this done. I very often get constituent calls, and I had constituent hours last week where people come and talk to me, and the two favorite things that people like to rail on are taxes and unions. And I'm just going to spend a second to talk about that. But what's interesting about both of those issues is, you know, I was born in 1957, and so, you know, I'll look at very often somebody from my generation and I'll say, well, you know, the world when we were born, that was really a good place, wasn't it? Much better than now. And they'll say, yeah, because we all wax nostalgic about the 50s and the early 60s when life seemed to be a lot easier and opportunities were ripe. And I say, well, wasn't that a great time? And people will say, yeah. And I'll say, well, the incremental top tax rate in 1957 was 91%. Let me say that again, because most people don't believe that. 91%. That was back when, in the recovery after World War II, we realized that we didn't want to borrow for generations to come, that we actually had a responsibility and obligation to pay back for that war, and we had a tax rate then at the top that would pay for it. So they're like, the first thing is shock and awe. The top rate now is 35%, going to 39% for those who make over 400 grand. So we're not even close. The other thing is, back then, labor unions represented about 35% of the private sector workforce, which again is a showstopper, because the people come in and they say, well, it's taxes and it's unions that are screwing everything up. And give me a time when tax rates were 91% at the top and 35% of the private sector was organized. So when we talk about where's the revenue going to come from, the first thing we need to do is look at how the economy is structured. You can't tax people who don't have the capacity to even put bread on the table at the end of the week. So when we talk about how do we raise revenue, the first thing you need to look at in an economy is where is the capacity to fund the work of government. You know, it's easy to agree on a long-term vision. We want to do this with our utilities. We want to do this with the environment. We want to invest in education, especially now early childhood education, because I'm a big believer in that. So you look at what the goals are, and then you say, okay, we need to budget for that. That's number two, just like running a business. What a surprise. Then you need to say, where's the revenue going to come from to do this? And you have to look at how the economy is structured. So the dialogue we've been hearing about the last few years, that the top 1% in this economy, whereas in the 70s that top 1% earned about 8% of the total income, that top 1% earns about 25% of the total income. Think about that. 1% at the top making 25% of what we all earn. Okay? Back at that time, the top 5% in this economy owned about 30% of the property and equity in this country. Now that top 5% owns about over 70% of the equity in this country. So if you're going to look at how we fund government, the first thing you have to look at is how is the economy structured overall, and where are we going to get the revenue? And what was it that Willie Sutton said, the bit about, you know, why do you rob banks? And he said that because that's where the money is. Well, you got to look at a tax and revenue policy that addresses where the prosperity has gone. So the first thing you would do is you would say, we got to look for the capacity to fund government where the prosperity has gone or where we've let it go over the course of the last 30 or 40 years. And so, Wendy, the answer to your question is we need better graduated income tax. We need to look at a tax policy that taxes wealth, not that just that taxes income. So we have to look at a capital gains tax. And we have to not ask, but we have to decide as a society that we are going to look where the prosperity is and use that prosperity, leverage that prosperity to allow future generations to prosper as well. If we don't do that, we're going to continue to borrow from the future to pay for the present, instead of paying for the present in order to fund a bright future. And we have to get real about that. It was one thing 5 years ago when the Dow Jones was at 7,000 or 8,000. Okay? Now it's over 15,000. We know that the recovery has happened overall. GDP is starting to pick up again. Dow Jones is up again. Employment numbers are starting to respond. But if, as we grow the society back, the economy back, the recovery happens by creating more jobs at minimum wage or low end of the income spectrum, those people will not be paying taxes, and those people will not be able to spend to re-engage the economy. So it's just not going to work. If, for example, on Cape Cod, we're building water infrastructure, we're taking advantage of the high-speed internet, we're really redoing our energy grid, and we're doing it at livable wage jobs, all of those people who we're paying to build that future are going to be able to go out and buy cars and eat at restaurants and support our retail and our tourism industry in much better ways. So this, to me, the whole thing, you connect a few of the dots. You look at how the economy is structured. You create a revenue code that will address that and bring the revenue in to fund a lot of the projects. That's what we're talking about. Those projects then create livable wage jobs, re-energize the middle class, and get the money back into circulation that honestly is not in circulation right now. One of the things I will tell you as a business person, there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines right now. When Cape Air goes out to borrow money, if it's a good business plan, we have people lined up to lend us money. The money is out there. The problem is a shortage of good business plans to get funded. And the reason for that is because when you put together a business plan for a restaurant or a retail store or a transportation company, you've got to show that the economy is strong enough so that people are going to come in and spend money there and support the business and generate the cash flow to pay back the debt. That's the problem in our economy right now. So, you know, if I were king for a day, what I would do is I would raise enough revenue today and create cash flow going forward to support the debt that we're going to need in order to pay for all the projects that you've been talking about today. From education to infrastructure, the hard and soft part of our economy, and invest it back into the people who have been so hollowed out and so hurt in the last 30 years in this economy. Without doing that, none of what we're talking about here today matters. I hate to be that bleak about it, and that's why when I say I need your help, I'm a little bit of a lone voice on some of these issues in the legislature right now. You would think that what I was talking about would sort of be the mainstream of one of our political parties. That would be the Democratic Party. And yet there are very few Democrats that you hear about on a state level that are actually saying this stuff. You know? Now again, I will go back and say we're not talking about taxing people more who don't have the capacity to even make their mortgage payment, put gas in the car, and put food on the table at the end of the day. much less pay for their medical expenses. So as top-heavy as the economy has gotten, we need to respond with a revenue and tax code that is top-heavy in that way, such that we will adequately fund the investments that we need to make. Other questions? Wendy, does that sort of answer the question?
Buying back the aged infrastructure that you referred to, do you think there's any reasonable probability that you can buy it back at depreciated value instead of a much higher price?
I think we really have to look at that, because you're right. I mean, they'll get paid twice. They're getting paid back now by charging for it, and then if we were to buy it back. But as Bill Doherty said, that's a real challenge. It's going to require courage and strength from our political leaders to say that every investment in life is not a guaranteed investment. You know, talking for a minute, one of the beautiful paradigms in energy to talk about is the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. It's like the best example of the problem that we're talking about. That plant was bought 12 years ago by a bunch of investors in a company that's in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's where their headquarters is. And when they bought it, they banked on getting a 20-year license renewal 12 years into them having bought it. So they bought it 12 years ago. It became 40 years old last year. They just got a 20-year relicense of that plant. It is aged, old, crumbling infrastructure, but we seem to be wanting to guarantee that investment risk for the people who bought that plant 12 years ago. And it's bizarre to me that we are guaranteeing an investment risk while creating a public safety risk for all of us who live near that plant. It just is a demonstration that our government needs to refocus. As I say, government is the civic expression of our collective will. Well, if the government is the civic expression of our collective will, somebody needs to explain why a government agency relicenses a 40-year-old nuclear power plant in our backyard so that investors in New Orleans, Louisiana, get the return on their investment covered. Now, to Bill's rather cynical point about, no, we will not be able to buy it back at a cheap price, I think there's a lot of ways to look at that, and I think we need to work on that, because we do have to buy it back at a reduced price if we're going to use it. Yep.
He's got one there. Good.
So speaking of buying things back, Verizon has been doing an audit of all their telephone poles in the state, charging back the people who are on those poles. They sold off their copper plant in 3 other New England states. Tea leaves would indicate something's about to happen there. Are your colleagues in the legislature thinking about that and considering what the implications might be and what the state's response to that would be? And would that be an area where maybe the state becomes the acquirer rather than a company that goes bankrupt within a month of taking over?
That's a great question. I mean, I would go out on a limb and say right now the legislators in the state don't have the appetite. Not all of the legislators have the appetite to be thinking about that. I certainly do. Now, the state, there's not really an entity at a state level that has the capacity to make an acquisition like that. So I think it would have to be, we'd have to be creative about how we would structure it. But yeah, I mean, that is a concern.
Senator, I like a lot of what you're saying, but it seems that, you know, part of the issues that we struggle with here are the fact that much of this takes, you know, a long-term vision and a long-term plan and sticking with it. But yet, business cycles, election cycles, and so forth are all short-term focus. I mean, how do we get around that problem?
It took us 30 years to get into this, and I am a long-term thinking person. Even at the company that Lynn and I run together, I really think in 20-year. So when we sit down and do a strategic plan, we think about next year and 3 years, but we're actually thinking 20 years from now, what is our company going to look like? public servants have an obligation to be doing that as well. Part of what got me into politics, I hadn't even thought about running for political office until about 3.5 years ago. Part of what got me into it is I looked at my 3 daughters and I was thinking, okay, 20 years from now, what's this all going to look like? We're going to be giving them a 60-year-old nuclear power plant. We're still going to be distributing energy on power lines and on telephone poles that are way antiquated. If you go elsewhere in the world, by the way, I mean, we think we're a leader in everything. Go overseas to Western Europe and see how they're distributing energy now. See what the investments they've made in the grid is. So we need to elect people who have a long-term vision. You know, if I could snap my fingers, the first thing I would do is get rid of this 2-year term thing that I'm in. The fact that our state legislators have to run for every 2 years means that we're on a continual election cycle, raising funds and worrying about the next election, taking votes that, as I put it, you got people watching Fox television at night and then telling you what the world looks like to them the next day. And if you're a legislator that responds to that, we're taking votes based on what people saw on television the night before. That's not going to work. We need a long-term vision. We need political leadership, smarter leadership, I would say, that says 20 years from now, what do we want this to look like? What do we want our economy to look like? What do we want our environment to look like? What do we want our education and our healthcare to look like? And then it is time right now, and I hate to say it because I sound impetuous and impatient, but we need to be patient about it. We need to shift the trajectory and then let it play out over the next 20 years. And if we do that, instead of responding to election cycles in short term, then that'll happen. The money in politics and the money in elections make it very difficult and problematic. I am an optimist because I'm seeing more and more people jump into the political process for the reasons that I got in, and people who talk the language more like the language that I'm speaking today. And I am seeing more and more of that, and I'm encouraged by that. But there are many people in the room here probably who have said, gee, maybe I should run for office sometime. My answer, Stephanie Cox, is yes, run for office. Do it, get involved. Because we need people to put themselves out there to articulate a message that is bold and visionary and forward-looking, and then put themselves out there to run. So, next question. Ask me some hard questions.
Dan, one of the things you had not brought up is that the attitude about a short-term investment in time and energy is also reflected in what I would call the quarterly reporting thing that goes on in large companies. That they look for what have you done in this quarter and not what you have done in the for the year or for a long term. You are part of an employee-owned company, and I would suggest to you that you have more control over the philosophy that guides your company than much of corporate America. Having said that, and having heard what sounds like the Paul Krugman economist view of what we should do with regard to the investment that people are willing to make, if we can change the attitude that says that you reward the managers and non-owners of corporations, at that time of the 90% tax rate, there was more of an incentive to invest in the business, because if you didn't invest in the business and took it as an outcome, you then were, you were then taxed at what was considered to be a very high rate. So it seems to me that the paradigm at that time was very clear. If you were making money, you had an incentive to put it in the business grew, employment grew. You don't have that now.
Well, I just want to say the last time that Paul Krugman spoke, somebody raised their hands and says, that really sounds like a Dan Wolfe view of the world. What you're getting at, and I'm just going to take a couple other random sectors of the economy. Take food production. If you want to see the best example of why government relaxing and allowing the free market to do its thing based on the next quarterly reports is look at Monsanto, look at our meat production with everything from steroids to antibiotics, hormones. I mean, it's a horrible industry. Look at the outcome in our youth and the health of our youth, and you think, wow, how's that working? Or on the other side of the food scale, it's McDonald's and Burger King. So you look at investor-driven nutrition and you say, wow, where is government? What is the FDA doing? The same thing with pharmaceuticals. Look at it in financial services. When you have investor-driven financial service companies, what happens versus mutually owned banks or cooperatives or even credit unions? The difference in the outcome is entirely different dependent on the ownership structure. One of the things government needs to do is look at desired outcomes and then structure regulation, legislation, and tax policy consistent with long-term outcomes. You can have a healthy economy as defined by next quarter, but just as important in the role of government is to say, how about healthy community? We should not only insist on healthy economy as defined by those metrics we talked about earlier, but we should also define it by the outcomes that those corporations are giving us. And I really, one of the nuances with a business person being in government is, what's government's role in working the private sector so that it not only delivers innovation and sustainability and good jobs at livable wages, but so that it also delivers healthy food, healthy financial services and banking, good health care, and smart, sustainable energy production. It is achievable. And I got to tell you, I'm going to need some allies up there, because as we look at how to do that, government, again, regulation, legislation, tax policy, vision, and infrastructure. Those are the 5 things we look for from government. And if you look at any one of those, we've abdicated or stepped backwards in the last 30 years. So it's time to move ahead again and get some bold people into it who can speak the language and again, with the long-term vision. I'm an optimist, though, Bill. When I say imagine, I really believe that we can get there.
Senator, following up on the discussion earlier today about edX. edX, is put in place and is helping leapfrog higher education into the future around the world by democratizing access to education. If we applied that same focus and principle to government and created GovX, what are the things that you would see that we should target for 10 to 15 years from now?
So I'm gonna plead a little bit of ignorance. edX, I'm assuming that's internet education?
No, it was really started by a conglomeration of universities basically trying to say, how can we create greater access to education without having necessarily to provide people coming to campus. And it's really using web and technology to create broader access.
And yeah, I mean, that's a very broad question. I mean, I think that the use of technology relative to government really is around informing people and having a two-way dialogue with citizens about what government is doing and what their ideas, and incorporating that in. So the wonderful opportunity through technology to engage and inform and educate people. On the other hand, just like education, I think a lot of government, good government, depends on social interaction around the product. One of the concerns I have about education on the internet is it's not a social endeavor. So I think we have to find out ways to include and embrace that technology while not cutting out the human and social interactions, the community aspect of education. I feel the same way about government. It scares the hell out of me to think that government at some days becomes people sitting in front of their computers in isolated homes being asked, the following question, should we do this as public policy? And people vote yay or nay, without the ability to have the messy process of dialogue and back and forth and input. So if it's interactive and social, I say it's a good thing. If it's isolating and antisocial, I say it's not a good thing. And that would be my opinion. I don't know if that even comes close to answering the question you asked. But I am hugely in favor, through transparency and information sharing, of using those technologies in government, though.
Go ahead. When you were talking about encouraging people to run and getting excited about that, does that mean we can get excited about your running for governor yet?
Boy, this would be easy. All in favor of that? If only it were that simple. Choose not to answer. I'd be very direct about it. I'm going to be making a decision about that in the very near future. It has to be not only the desire, but it has to be the art of the possible. A guy from Cape Cod the way Massachusetts is structured, we're very Boston-centric. So the process I'm going through is to trying to determine whether I can have the right support and the right platform in Boston to really make a run at it. I would love to do it. I mean, clearly I'm very passionate about this, but it also has to be something that's achievable and attainable. I will tell you that the strength from this community, not about getting somebody elected, it really is about what I said at the beginning. The intellectual and creative capital is inspirational for somebody like me. It informs me, it inspires me, and I would be an extension of this community, which I think could do great things around the Commonwealth, should I be able to do it. So if that happens, we're all in this together. How does that sound?
Let us know how we can help.
Great.
Good afternoon. I'd like to second the nomination for Stephanie Cox. But you hear a lot of this information about immigration and undocumented workers at the national level. What's happening at the state level, and what can we do locally?
Well, it really, not to pass the buck, this really is and needs to start with the federal government. It really is a federal issue. The bills that we have on immigration these days seem to be, again, how can we beat up on the least fortunate and go after people who have basically had nothing to do with their being here as undocumented citizens. So I think we need to keep the door open for in-state tuition for those who are here because their parents brought them here. I think we need to not take steps backwards and encourage people to leave who can actually add a lot to our lives here, contribute a lot, because most of the immigrants here have made or are making great contribution. On a state level, we have to look at what the federal government does and react to that, but I think we should be very careful not to be taking steps backwards. Most of the immigration laws that I see are actually laws of how to find people who are not documented and then either ask them to leave or not allow them to have benefits that the rest of us have, things like driver's licenses and access to any of the social, human, or health care services that we get. I think that's wrong and short-sighted. So we're hoping the federal government does the right thing and then gives us the opportunity to build on that. Obviously, I'm not shy of saying controversial things to 50,000 homes on cable.
You mentioned that you're a Cape-centric guy, and we're here all day today talking about how do we implement wastewater facilities and the broadband and education with plans to raise taxes at the State House. How do we make sure that our donations to the state come back to us in an equal percentage?
Well, first of all, there are no plans to raise taxes at the State House. And based on what I said about 20 minutes ago, I think that's probably unfortunate, although we don't like to use the tax word, we like to use the revenue word. But as I said before, we shouldn't be raising taxes on those who can't afford it, but we should be looking for sources of revenue from those who can afford it. The reason we score bad on formulas, getting money back to the Cape, is because our real estate values are relatively high and our incomes are relatively low. So if I did have more say at a state level, what I would look at doing is redoing some of those formulas so that we are not weighted so heavily in ways that benefit communities in effect relative to where the state money gets distributed, where the incomes and the property values are low. So that's one answer. But the other answer we have to realize is our towns on the Cape, because real estate values are relatively high, do have the ability to raise more revenue from real estate than a lot of parts of the Cape. So even though the formula is disproportionately impacting us negatively, people from around the state say to me, well, gee, you have all of these second homeowners with expensive homes, you're getting the tax revenue from all of that. That's not happening here in Roxbury. And I would put the question back to you, how would you answer that question? The homeowners on the waterfront in Chatham are contributing a lot to the school system in Chatham. Other parts of the state don't have that access to revenue. It isn't fair now, but I think parity is somewhere in between what we'd like to see and where we are today. The real challenge on the Cape is people really do think we're a bunch of wealthy people here on the Cape. You know, you look at the statistics, the year-round income of those who live here is lower than the state average, actually. So that is a real problem. And we, you know, the delegation, myself included, spends a lot of time up there trying to get that formula relooked at, the Chapter 70 formula for the schools and the local aid formula as well. We're going to continue doing that. And we do send a lot more to the state than we get back. That is for sure.
Hi, Dan, back here. While imagining the future 20 years out, what does some of the innovation look like around entitlement programs?
What a great question that is. As far as understanding the need and addressing the need, I don't. Do you have any thoughts on that? Let's hear them.
Well, I would start by saying I think the majority disincentivize people to step away from the programs and lock them in for life. And so that's just a little a personal perspective in some of the work that I've done. So I see a lot of this innovation conversation happening around the things that we can point to easily, but I think the things that are, you know, really, I think, creating barriers in many ways to achieving some of those things, using human power to achieve those things, aren't being looked at all. And so I think it has to be part of that formula, that imagining. Just my 2 cents. Yeah,
and you know, it is the case that in a society and in a community where there is actually less opportunity, my kids are fortunate. They got a great education at Nauset High School, and they're from a family that, you know, read to them while they were young and has engaged intellectual conversations around the dinner table. So I'm not as concerned about my 3 kids, but even for them, I'm not clear what they're going to be doing in 10 years. So, you know, part of the problem is what we don't want to do is say, gee, we're creating entitlement programs and we're creating government dependency. On the one hand, we want to undo that without making sure that we're creating opportunities for people to move into. My fear right now is less about nurturing and creating dependence on government programs and more about, are we doing things that create a private sector that is vibrant and creating opportunities? So my focus would be, instead of pushing people out, it would be creating an economy that sucks people up from where they are, that actually inspires and engages and has so much opportunity that people will rise to it. I have very rarely experienced in life people who are satisfied with being on entitlement programs. What I've experienced is people who are resigned and depressed because they see a lack of opportunity. So again, it is about access to education. It's about making a public commitment to adequately fund so that those jobs are created. It's about skills training, workforce development, workforce training, et cetera. Yep. Do you have a follow-up?
I just think the two have to be connected.
Yep.
And I mean, we've seen some of the, even the work that we've talked about here today, some of the innovation that's happening, and where have those opportunities for job creation measured up with job training programs, which measured up to recruiting locally for that workforce. And just, I think that the smarter approach has to be applied evenly across all of the components.
Yeah, so the committee that I'm chair of at the State House, which is Labor and Workforce Development, is really looking to invest money into collaborative endeavors between our WIBs, between our career centers, between our regional technical schools, between our community colleges. We need the revenue to invest to get those entities in partnership with the private sector to build programs that are relevant. Cape Air right now is in the process of developing a program with Cape Cod Community College for aviation technicians, because it turns out that there's a shortage of aviation technicians nationwide. There's about a 300,000 technician shortage. We suffer from it at the airline because we can't hire good mechanics. So that this is a great opportunity for the public and private to work together to create good jobs. You know, Cape Cod Community College has done a tremendous job, as have our tech schools, working with the Career Center and the WIB. We need to do more of that. And we need to fund those programs adequately and engage the private sector in those discussions as well. So there is a tremendous opportunity. But, you know, one of the things that drives me crazy is we have the conversation about one of the problems with our youth relative to substance abuse and mental health and crime is that there is not adequate parenting on the one hand, and on the other hand, we want to destroy any entitlement that it will allow someone to stay home and be a parent by saying, okay, if you're on welfare for 5 years, you can't be on welfare anymore. Well, the kid gets born, it's 5 years old, and now both parents have to leave and be absentee parents. That makes no sense relative to social programs to me. And yet, you know, the welfare to work, that so-called program, is forcing single parents to be zero parents in some cases. So I think we have to be careful that the so-called entitlements, that in undoing those and forcing people out into the workplace, so to speak, A, there has to be a workplace to force them into, and B, we have to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences with doing that as well.